Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm sharing Spooky Watercolor Magic using some Simon Hurley stamps with coordinating Spellbinders dies. This here is the Hocus Pocus stamp and die set. Then we have the adorable Halloween Pets stamp and die set, and each one of these has lots of different sentiments to choose from to go with the images. I always love sets that have stamps with images as well as sentiments, and this one here is the framed Fright stamp and die set. So you can see those dies on the back. I just put them right in the packages with the stamp set so that I know exactly where they are. I'm going to start off by stamping and embossing my images, and anytime I have a new stamp set that I haven't used before, I use a white eraser on the stamping surface. It just removes any possible manufacturing residue and helps that stamp take ink just a little bit better. And then I use a brush to brush off any eraser bits and make sure that none of that is left on there. This only needs to be done one time. I just do it the very first time I use a set, and I do the entire set at the same time so that I know if I've used one stamp, I've done the whole set. I don't have to do it. They're all good to go. Once I have this done, I'm going to be using my Misti stamping tool to stamp the images, and I'll stamp them a couple times, and I'm going to heat emboss the images. I'm watercoloring these images, so anytime I watercolor, for the most part, I typically will emboss the images because I like that raised edge and I like that it gives it a different texture. I'm using some hot press watercolor paper here. This one is Arches. You can use whatever type of watercolor paper you love. The one thing to note though is when you have watercolor paper, often there's a smooth side and a more textured side. I will stamp on the most smooth side so that it makes it easier to get crisp images. If you do it on the really textured side, sometimes your images are not complete, and sometimes you'll kind of warp them as you're pressing down to try to get it in all of those recessed areas. I put a little bit of embossing powder tool on my cardstock and then stamped a couple times with that VersaMark ink. Then I'm going to pour my embossing powder onto the stamped images and heat emboss them. And I'm using black embossing powder for most of my images, but when it comes to those frames, I'm going to do them in gold embossing powder. I thought it would be nice to have those in gold. You can see that the one on my top left, I missed part of that image when I was pressing that stamp down. So I'm just not going to be using that one. I'll restamp it on a different piece of watercolor paper because I'm going to be doing several different images. I have lots of cardstock to go around. I'm actually going to be creating 5 different cards out of these 3 stamp and die sets. So I just love the different images here. It was hard to narrow it down on which I wanted to use. Obviously those dogs, I'm definitely a dog person, so those ghost dogs are absolutely adorable. But that little cat in the pumpkin was also just the cutest thing ever, and I had to include that. From the Hocus Pocus stamp set, I'm using that witch on the broom. I'm also stamping one of the sentiments there. The bats stamp from the first sheet was also from this set. So once again, once I have my images positioned, I'm going to put some embossing powder tool on that cardstock, and that just helps the embossing powder stick mainly to the ink that you're stamping with. If you have any powder sticking anywhere that you don't want it to be, you can just use a soft brush to brush it off, but that powder definitely helps to not stick to where you've touched the cardstock, where your oils from your fingers have gone. So it's definitely helpful to do that step first, and you get a cleaner, crisper result. So here is the second image. Again, pouring that embossing powder on there, tapping the excess off. Anything that goes on that scrap paper goes right back into the jar, and that's one of the things I love about embossing is there's no waste because everything gets caught by that scrap piece of paper and goes right back into the jar. Then I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. You can see there's a tiny little spot at the bottom of the pumpkin that kind of got missed. I'm leaving it. That's good enough for me. I didn't think it was worth stamping that thing a third time, and to me, that's a really minor flaw in there. So the last thing I'm going to do is stamp 2 frames and emboss them with gold, and then I'm going to stamp the images for putting in those frames. And both the frame as well as those images have dies that coordinate with them, and there's also a die that coordinates with the inside of the frame. So you could easily cut the outside and inside of the frame out if you want. I'm only going to be cutting out the outside. So I pour on the embossing powder and then tap off the excess and heat emboss the image. I absolutely love this frame, and I think it's a great one that could also be used with other things like different die sets as well. I think you could get a really unique look to it. Now, I was hoping to be able to fit 2 frames onto one piece of cardstock, but they're just a little bit too close to each other, and I want to make sure that I have room for die cutting them. So I'm just going to put it on a separate piece of cardstock, and then I will stamp the images for the inside on the other side that that frame is on. So again, I put the embossing powder tool on there. I stamped it twice. Then we're pouring that embossing powder on there, tapping off the excess, and then heat embossing the powder on there. Again, if there's any powder sticking where you don't want it to go, you definitely want to make sure to take it off before you go and do your heat embossing. Once that powder is heated on there, you're not going to be able to get that off, so you do it before it gets melted. So the last step here is to put the images that I want to go inside my frames. So I'm going to do one of them, the little cat in the suit, and I'm going to heat emboss that with black. Now the sentiments for two of the sets, the Halloween pets as well as the Hocus Pocus, do not have dies for, framed frights do not have dies for those sentiments. There are dies for the sentiments in the Hocus Pocus set. So I'm going to be stamping those sentiments right on the background of my card. So I don't need to stamp them on here because I can't die cut them, and I don't really want them trimmed with a trimmer. I don't want those straight edges on there. So my solution is just to do them on the background before I do my ink blended backgrounds. Once again, poured that embossing powder on there after using the embossing powder tool and stamping with the VersaMark ink, then melted the powder. And you can see that the first embossing I did, my heat tool was cool, so it took a little bit longer. Now that I've done a bunch of embossing, that heat tool is nice and warm, so it embosses super, super quick. Last one here, I'm going to do the skeleton in the hat and the suit, stamping it a couple times after using the embossing powder tool. And I'm once again going to do this with black embossing powder, and then we're going to heat up that embossing powder and melt it. And then we're going to be ready to do our watercoloring. Now, I love when I'm doing Halloween things using bright, bold colors for them. I personally am not a spooky Halloween person. I tend to be a bright colored, funky, happy Halloween person. But one of the things that I wanted to do was do my watercoloring with interference inks so that anywhere that watercolor is a little bit heavier, it has a little bit of shimmer to it. So for the first color here, I'm using some pumpkin spice. This one, you can see a bright orange there, but anywhere the color is a little bit heavier, there's going to be some of the interference shimmer settled in there. And for the orange, that interference color is purple. Now, if you've never seen these pads before, I have a whole playlist where I create cards with them. You'll find a lot of inspiration there. These pads are like two pads in one. There's one color that shows up on white or light cardstock. In this case, it's the orange. And then there's a separate color that shows up on black or dark cardstock, and that would be the purple interference color. They're pretty fun to work with and amazing to work with. And I love the fact that even when you're using it on light colors, where that color is a little bit dark, you still see, or dark tone, you still see that interference color. It still has that shimmer to it. And I thought that was perfect for Halloween cards. So that's why I opted to do my watercoloring with the interference inks. But you could do them with dye-based inks if you want, whatever you like to do your watercoloring with. But for these, I just thought they kind of take it to the next level. They just add a little bit of magic to this watercoloring. The next color I'm using is Regal Gray, and we see gray on the white or light cardstock, but again has a purple interference to it. So anywhere the ink is a little bit darker on our images, it's going to have that purple color to it. So typically for these images, I will go over most of it with just a really diluted shade of this color. And then I'll dot in heavier amounts where I want the color to be a little bit darker. So for our little witch's robe here, I want the whole thing to be gray, but I want there to be some darker color where it bunches towards her waist, where we have a little bit of a ripple of the fabric. It would be darker. There would be some shadow behind that. For our skeleton here, I'm going to make it darker just around the outside edges. Now, I didn't want my skeleton to be too dark, so I didn't do a whole lot of shading on him. For these dogs, I'm going to do a kind of a light coat of the Regal Gray over the whole thing. Then I'm going back in and putting some shadows between or behind where those ripples of fabric would be. There would be a shadow in there. So we want the upper layers to be lighter and the back or the recessed areas to be a little bit darker. Now, when it comes to watercolor, you can always take extra paint off. It sits on the surface for just a little while. To my right, I have a piece of paper towel that I can use to wipe off my brush. This brush has water right in the handle, so I don't have to have a jar of water on my desk, which is very, very handy. For that paper towel, I can squeeze the handle of my brush and it will squeeze water right through those bristles and clean them out so that I can easily change to a completely different color. Once I have my area colored, I will just set it aside to dry. But because I have my images heat embossed, all of those lines there have a little bit of a raised ridge. So it makes it easy to watercolor one color in one area and then a different color in the area right beside it. And I don't have to wait till the first area is dry. Because of that little bit of ridge, it's going to leave the watercolor in the area that I'm coloring it in. So I find it's a little bit more forgiving and it makes watercolor a little bit easier. This third color here is Crushed Velvet. This is a nice bright pinky purple color, but the interference color for this is gold. So anywhere we have a darker tone of this color, we're going to see just little deposits of that gold shimmer to it. So you can see I went over that whole suit and just did a really light tone, and then I'm going back and I'm making darker areas where I want some of that shadow to go. So right in the inside of the collar, right underneath where the collar lip would lay, that would be darker. I'll look at the images and you can see that there's some shadow where the pits of the suit would be. That's where I'm going to put a little bit of heavier amount of that paint as well. And because I go over that whole area with a light amount, that area is still wet. So it makes it really easy when I go in to put a heavier amount there. It makes it really easy to deposit those colors, and it starts to blend and bleed right into the other areas really, really quickly. The fourth color I'm using here is Magic Garden. This is a nice bright vibrant green. The interference color to this one is purple, so I'm going to use it to start for the cat's eyes. For the witch, I'm going to use it for her skin, and some of these areas are really, really tiny, so I'm not doing a whole lot of keeping areas light or dark. Obviously with the cat's eyes, it's just a tiny little area, so I'm going to leave it whatever color it comes out of my brush. For the witch's skin, there are still some really tiny areas. So some of them are lighter. I'll put it darker where her hair is, but I don't worry about it too much when the area is really, really tiny. The last color I'm using is Milk Chocolate Roses for the dogs. This is a brown, but it has like a pinky coral shimmer to it. Now again, I go over those areas with a light tone, and then I'll make it a little bit darker towards the bottom of the ears where that tail comes out behind the little ghost sheet, as well as where the paws come out behind the ghost sheet. Once I have all of my different areas on those images colored, I'm going to set those aside to dry. For my frames, I'm using the Lisa Horton gold pad to just color in the areas of the actual frame. And then I'm going to use some interference inks for the center of that frame so that it has a nice bright vibrant color behind it. Now you could always use like a yellow tone as well if you wanted to do the inside of the frame, but because it's embossed with that gold ink, I thought using, or embossed with gold powder, I thought using gold ink to do the watercolor in between those gold embossed lines just would complement it really nicely. And again, because of the embossed ridges from the lines of the frame, I don't wait for that to dry before I start to watercolor the inside part of the frame. I start to color it right away because the lines from the embossing are going to hold that in. And I'm pressing my pad onto an acrylic block to use as my palette. Just a nice non-porous surface that I had in my craft room. You could use a plate, you could use a piece of plastic, whatever works. Now I'm doing it right from the pad. I do happen to have the reinkers for all of the interference pads, and I could certainly do it from the reinkers. You do want to make sure that you shake those reinkers to make sure that interference mica is fully mixed in there before you pour a dot of it onto your acrylic block to use as a paint palette. And absolutely, it totally works really, really well. Pressing the pads onto a surface and using that just works really, really easily, and it's not a whole lot of mess. I have a microfiber cloth that I use for wiping off the acrylic block between different colors. And after a few colors, I do go and rinse that cloth off because the ink starts to build up in there. For the inside of these frames, you can see that I'm making the color lighter towards the inside, darker towards the edge. I start where I want my color to be darkest, so I start at the edge of the frame and then just work my way in. We're going to have those images, the cat in the suit and the skeleton in the suit going toward or going on top of the centers of these frames. So I'm not really worried about the center because it's going to be covered. I also love the look of having lights and darks in different areas. I think it just gives it a little bit more visual interest. Once our watercolored images are dry, I will tape the coordinating dies to them and die cut them. I did this one on screen. I did the rest of them off screen because the process is exactly the same. So now we're ready to start putting our cards together. I'm going to start with the Halloween pets. I picked out one of the sentiments from that set. This piece of cardstock here is trimmed to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and I'm stamping that sentiment with in VersaMark ink and then heat embossing the sentiment on my background. This way it's going to show up, and I'm going to do some super simple ink blending on my backgrounds. I want the main star of the show to be the images and the sentiments, not necessarily the backgrounds. So super simple ink blending is a great way to add color but not take any attention away from our adorable little images here. So once again, another piece of hammer wheel cardstock that is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. I positioned the cat with the pumpkin above the sentiment here. I wanted to make sure that everything was spaced nicely before positioning that stamp and then stamping it with the VersaMark ink and pouring on the black embossing powder and heat embossing it. Now I'm going to ink blend my backgrounds with some distress inks. You could use the interference inks to ink blend backgrounds. The interference pads tend to be fairly juicy and you get a really heavy amount of the ink. So for me, distress inks are just dye based. They're very simple. They're nice bright colors for the ones that I'm choosing. And I have a little bit more control over those backgrounds. And again, I don't want the background to overwhelm the actual image. That first color I used there was Twisted Citron. Then I have a little bit of Hickory Smoke that I'm just kind of adding a little bit of mist to that sky. And then I'm using some carved pumpkin for the nice bright orange color. I'm making my backgrounds bright just as my images were bright. So I want them to be nice, fun, cheery Halloween cards. So I just thought the orange, I picked colors that I thought would bring out some of the colors in the images. I have a piece of Raven cardstock here that is trimmed to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches for my mat here. I'm using an A2 card base. All of my cards in this video are A2, so they're 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. After gluing on that mat, I glued on our ink blended background, and then we're going to glue on our die cut dog images. So I'm starting with the larger one, and then I'm going to put the smaller one a little bit forward and to the left. Now, the great thing about having these images die cut is it gives a little bit of a halo around the outside of the image when you do the die cutting, but it also gives a little bit of extra texture because it's an extra piece of cardstock on top of that background. To add even more texture, I'm putting some glossy accents on top of the little pumpkin that the dog is holding. I'm also going to put a dot on each one of their noses. This is simply going to add some glossy dome dimension to the areas that it is applied to. It does take a while for it to dry, so this amount here I would probably let it dry for about a half an hour. When you first put it down, it has a milky hue to it. When it's dry, it dries completely clear. It reduces in size by just a little bit, but it's completely clear. Now, if by chance you need to test it to make sure that it's dry, I would suggest putting an equal amount on a scrap piece of paper so that you can test the scrap piece of paper. If you touch the glossy accents before it's actually dry, you start to get a little bit either of a fingerprint in there. Sometimes you'll pick a little bit of up. You'll ruin the surface of it. So you definitely don't want to touch it until you know that it's 100% dry. For the second background here, I started off with that Twisted Citron on the bottom. I wanted it to look like for the first one that the dogs were on grass, and for this one that the cat and the pumpkin are on grass. But then I wanted a little bit of a Halloween-y spooky sky to it. So again, I used some Hickory Smoke to create some hazy clouds in that background, and then use some Villainous Potion Distress ink. I have another 4 inch by 5 1/4 inch mat for this card. Then I'm putting on that ink blended background, and finally we'll put on our little cat in the pumpkin. Now I'm also going to add a little bit of texture to these guys as well, or this one as well. I'm going to use the glossy accents just on the cat eyes. To add a little bit of texture to the pumpkin, I'm using some stickles. I use an iridescent one that doesn't have any color to it, so it's only going to add the texture as well as the sparkle. We're still going to be able to see the watercolored color underneath it. Now I am only putting it around the edges because it's going to take less time to dry, as well as the fact that I want the stickles to be kind of an accent piece. I don't want that entire pumpkin to be sparkly. I want it just to give it a little bit of texture and some interest. So I put the stickles on there and I set that aside to dry as well. For this next one here, we're going to use the image from the Hocus Pocus stamp and die cut set. So we have our witch on the broom, we have our sentiment that's already die cut, and then I have those bats that are going to scatter along the background. So I wanted to create a bit of a spooky sky here, so I started with that hickory smoke to do some wispy clouds. Then I did the villainous potion, and then I'm going to do some carved pumpkin in the center. Now, I didn't want my background to be too dark and overwhelming, but you certainly could make it darker than this. Once my card is done, I realized that I could have gone a lot darker with that background. Another thing that I think would be cool in this background would be to use a circle mask to create a moon behind her. You could also use some sparkle splatter accents to create some stars in the sky. I think that would be a nice accent to the background as well. There's really so many different ways that you can go with this. I kept it fairly simple. And again, because those images are die cut, you can easily move and position them where you want. Another option would be to stamp and emboss those images right on that background, do a watercolored background, and then have everything as one image on the background. For these, I really like the look of them being die cut and being separate because, like I said before, it just gives that extra little bit of texture. And here I can coordinate and move those bats around. If I were to stamp them on the background, they would all be one cluster. I wouldn't be able to move them around like this. So once we have all of those stamped, I'm going to add just a little bit of stickles onto the end of her broom just for a little sparkle. I realized after assembling this piece that I actually didn't watercolor the handle to the witch's broom, so I just grabbed that milk chocolate roses and quickly watercolored it. I typically don't watercolor after a card is assembled, but it looked a little bit odd being blank. Another option would have been to just use a dye-based marker and just color it in quickly, but because I had the milk chocolate roses sitting right there, I thought I might as well just do that really quickly. So after I put that stickles on there, I set those aside to completely dry. For my last two cards, I wanted to have a gold mat around our piece. Now, the easiest way to do this would be to use some specialty cardstock, but sometimes I don't have a specialty cardstock in the exact color I want. So my next easiest way to do this is to use a piece of Hammermill cardstock and then use the Lisa Horton gold ink pad. This is the same pad that I used to color in the embossed frames here, so it's going to coordinate nicely with those. I laid my frame out on my piece of Hammermill cardstock here. This is the one that I'm going to ink blend. This is trimmed down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches. The mats that I put the gold ink on were trimmed down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. For these sentiments, I'm putting gold embossing powder on, but you certainly could do them in black if you wanted them to be a little bit more prominent. Now, I did the gold because we have the gold frame, we have the gold mat that goes around it, and I thought it would coordinate nicely with that. But again, if you want the sentiments to be more prominent, you absolutely could do black embossing powder because our main image, the skeleton in the suit or the cat in the suit, are embossed with black embossing powder. So they would certainly coordinate with that. For this one here, I'm just doing some twisted citron around the outside edges. I'm not doing the center part because that is where my frame is going to go, and there's no point in putting any ink there because it's going to be completely covered. I glued my mat on first, and that mat, I only put the ink around the outside edges, again, because our ink blended piece is going to totally cover that. We're not going to even see it, so there's no point in having any ink there and having to wait for all of that to dry. Once we have our ink blended background with the sentiments on there, we can add our frame. I opted to do a sentiment on the top and a sentiment on the bottom, but you could easily reduce it and just have one sentiment if you wanted. Those two sentiments just happen to work well together, and I do 2 sentiments for the next one as well, again, because it just works well together, and I think it suits the whole vibe of the thing. I'm going to do some glossy accents on the eyes of my cat, and then I'm doing some stickles, and I'm just putting it on the little bow tie. Again, it just gives a little bit of extra texture. There's no color here because there's no color in those stickles. You certainly could put a colored one if you want because they do come in a whole bunch of, or whole variety of different colors. I like this one because it just adds that sparkle and texture, and it always coordinates with whatever colors you're using in the card that you're creating. So for my last one here, once again, I'm putting my sentiments above and below, making sure that they leave enough space for that frame. So I've laid that frame out there to make sure that I have enough space for it. Then I can put that embossing powder tool on that background. And again, this piece of Hammermill cardstock is 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches to accommodate our mat with that gold ink around the outside edges. I stamped it with that VersaMark ink and poured the gold embossing powder on there. Then we can pour the excess back into the container and heat emboss those sentiments. Then we can do our ink blending on the background of this card. And again, I chose to do bright, bold colors here. If you're more of a spooky vibe person, you can absolutely change the color palette to make them into more spooky cards if that is your preference. For this one here, I use that carved pumpkin distress ink. And again, not going towards the center or not inking in the center because that whole frame is going to cover it. When I'm doing my ink blending with distress inks, I say this all the time, I intentionally make some areas darker and some areas lighter. In this case, we're darker towards the outside edges and it goes lighter towards the middle. Personally, I just think it makes it more visually interesting. So I do it because of a personal preference. I like there to be lights and darks and unevenness to it. I think to me, perfection is not super interesting, so I don't try to make everything perfect. But if you prefer it to be completely even, you absolutely can, and you have that control when you're doing the ink blending. After putting our ink blended background down, I'm going to glue that frame on there, and then we are going to glue our die cut skeleton in a suit. And then we can add the glossy accents and the stickles. In this case, I'm going to put glossy accents on the little monocle that he is wearing. And then I'm going to put some stickles on his little bow tie. I also put a little bit on the brim around his hat, on the band around his hat, and on the little handkerchief in his pocket. Again, just different areas to give it a little bit of sparkle. There's not really a right or wrong where to put it. I just love the look that it gives when it gives it extra texture. I let all of those pieces dry just a little bit, and here is the finished card. We have a lot of texture between the different layers from those die cuts as well as our embossing, and then in those little tiny pockets where that ink is darker, we have little touches of the interference shimmer, which really adds a bit of magic to these cards and just makes them really fun. Then the final thing of adding the glossy accents and the stickles just to give it a little bit of extra texture. It gives the cards different areas for the light to catch when you're looking at them. You'll find everything that I've used listed and linked down in the description box below, so that if there's something that I haven't mentioned, you'll likely find the answer there, or else leave a comment. I'm happy to answer. That third card there is our Hocus Pocus witch on the broom with the bats in the sky. And then we have our little kitty in that pumpkin. Absolutely adorable. These images are so cute. I absolutely love, my favorite one has to be the little dogs in those ghost costumes. I just think they're just the sweetest thing ever. And by adding the different accents on them, it just really takes those images to the next level and just gives them even more magic. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate all the time that you spend with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.